In this edition of Locked On Capitals, we talk about what the Capitals' summer plans should be. Next on Locked On Capitals.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. As always, this podcast is free and available on all the major platforms. And I want to thank you for making this your first listen or view of the day. Yes, this podcast is also available in video form, so head on over to YouTube and check it out. My name is Dan Holme. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. Today's episode is brought to you by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. In this edition of Locked On Capitals, we talk about the Capitals at the draft coming up. Kind of exciting. This team wants to get younger and faster. It seems to be the perfect recipe. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about who the Capitals should target at free agency. And then we will talk about how big of an impact the next head coach of the Capitals could have on this team. In this episode, we are happy to have Justin Trudel of Nova Caps. Justin, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back, Dan.
So the draft, that is one of the things to talk about here, just to start off here, is that, we hear all the time that this team needs to get younger. It needs to get faster. Well, I mean, this seems to be one of the perfect things is for the Caps to draft, a good young player here. In the Capitals find themselves in unfamiliar territory. The Caps will be taking part in this year's NHL draft lottery for the first time in nearly a decade, 2014 to be exact. How excited are you about the potential of what could be?
Yeah, I think for me, the main difference that we'll see in terms of the Caps and their future is, for the past decade, like you mentioned, we haven't really picked really high in the draft. So there's a real great opportunity to get an elite prospect. So we have a bunch of good prospects like Connor McMichael, Ivan Miroshchenko, and Henrik Slapierre, but we don't have that next guy, right? Like bona fide top liner on the forward side or bona fide top pairing defenseman on the defensive side. So that's the real difference we'll see here. Is a little more depth in the pipeline and might make some other prospects that are on the good side of the tiers expendable in the trade to kind of shore up some near-term issues in the lineup. But for the most part, at the best case scenario, we'll get an immediate NHL player. If you move up in the lottery, get into the Bedard, Fantilli, Michkov, Leo Carlson debate. But for the most part, at 8, if we stick there, then you get a solid, potential NHL star in the future that really can be part of that next core that the Caps will have after the Ovechkin era ends.
It is an exciting thing to think about, in the draft lottery in particular. Like I was talking about there, it has been quite some time since they've been in the draft lottery. The Caps currently have the 8th best odds, 6.0, at landing the number 1 overall pick, where the Canadian phenom Connor Bedard is widely expected to be selected first. With the 8th best odd, Washington has a 54.4 chance of staying put, but could also find themselves ending up with a first-round pick outside the top 8. I know that this is just kind of dreaming right now, but how excited would you be if the Caps landed Connor Bedard?
Oh, man, that'd be a fever dream for sure, but he's potentially franchise-altering. Like we've talked about in the past. You've seen that with players like Connor McDavid, Austin Matthews, Jack Hughes, these players, and then even Alexis Lafreniere for the Rangers, where they're talked about, really hyped up, coming into the draft. At least for Lafreniere, it took him a little longer to be a really actually contributing, effective, top line forward. But when you're looking at these types of players, especially Bedard, who's been really highly touted for years as being the number 1 overall draft pick here, he was unreal. Like, you look at his numbers from junior, they're just gaudy video game numbers. And then he did it at the World Championships too, before it got canceled. So, I mean, this is a guy that could potentially come in day 1 and start second line center.
I mean, potentially wherever he lands, it's the lottery, so it's a little bit different to understand fully where he's going to land. But there's the Blackhawks, there's the Ducks, there's these teams that have been involved in what I'm going to call Team Tank for quite some time. If you take a look at the Blue Jackets in particular, their last couple of weeks, I was listening to NHL Network Radio on the power play, and he goes, "I can't name off one of the players that's playing out on the ice. It was all AHLers and ECHLers." And when they were pressed on it, they're like, "Well, we're not trying to tank. We just want to get a look at some of our prospects." Really rather ridiculous. And if you take a look at it, Connor Bedard is one heck of a player, but I don't think he could change the fortunes of the Columbus Blue Jackets overnight. I think they tried to do that to an extent by getting Johnny Gaudreau, but you're going to have to build a supporting cast around someone like Connor Bedard. But I think, that would be worth it. But it is an exciting thing to think about here. The 2023 NHL draft class is considered to be one of the deepest classes in recent years, highlighted by the likes of Bedard, Adam Fantilli, Metke Michkov, Leo Carlson, and Zach Benson. With a little bit of luck, the Caps could find their way into the top 5 and grab one of this year's top prospects. If we look historically, Washington has not owned a top pick since 2007, and we recall what occurred in 2004 when the Caps climbed to the very top, drafting Alex Ovechkin. So it is a crazy thing to think about, but someone's got to win this whole thing, or someone's got to win the draft lottery anyway. So moving that aside from Connor Bedard, again, a fever dream. I like the way that you talked about that. Is who should they target at the draft? I heard that Brian McClellan said that they need to address the top 6. And they also talked about defense as well. I know it's a bit of an interesting position for the blue line because most of the guys on the blue line are under contract now. I think the last time I talked about you, it was John Carlson was the only one under contract. And now most of those positions have been spoken for. TVR got a new deal. Jensen got a new deal. Faravari and Alexiev are restricted free agents. I guess it's Matt Irwin. So who do you think that they should target at the draft?
Yeah, I think it really largely depends on where you kind of fall on the draft lottery. Like your strategy completely changes when you get to that point. Like obviously every team's going to have their big board that they look at and say that's largely going to really differ from what the top scouting agencies say. Like we've seen in the past, like the Montreal Canadiens taking Jesperi Kotkaniemi at 3, or the Detroit Red Wings taking Moritz Seider, and people were screaming about that pick, like, "Oh my God, what a reach!" And now Seider's one of the best players on the defensive side for young defensemen in the NHL. So there's some things around there where it's like the team's going to look at best player available. I think at that point it's like if you stick at 8, the odds of you getting a day 1 NHLer are pretty low unless you get someone that drops in the draft. Someone like Matvei Michkov might fall in the draft just because you look at some of these teams that are looking for day 1 NHLers in the top 5 because, 1, you make more money when you're good, and 2, potentially some of these teams, like you said, like Columbus is, you add Connor Bedard and they're probably not a playoff team, but then you have a top line potentially of Johnny Gaudreau, Connor Bedard, and Patrick Laine. So it's like there's things that happen.
That's interesting to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's some things there. It's like you get the best overall prospect and a day 1 NHLer in Bedard. That obviously changes the fortunes of the Caps pretty substantially. I mean, you add Connor Bedard in the mix as your second line center, no less. You're probably pretty happy with that turnout. But really, with 8. There's so many different variables that come into play. I would keep an eye out on the Nova Caps kind of Twitter, socials, or just the site if you go there, because we're going to kind of dig in a bit into some of the top prospects and just see what's there. Obviously, a lot of the analytical data isn't really available for amateurs, so it's tough to really see what NHL players or NHL teams will see in these players. But for the most part, you have to get best player available at 8. It doesn't matter what position they play at this point. I would expect that the near-term solution for top 6 and potentially on defense is going to be either through trade or free agency. I would expect the forwards to be through trade, just because if you want a younger player who's got high potential and high impact on a roster, they're not going to be in free agency. Like unless you see a team doing what they did last season with Chicago non-tendering Dylan Strome for some unknown reason, like the odds of that happening again are probably pretty low. So for the most part, unless you're looking at a player like Michael Bunting in free agency, and who knows if he sticks around in Toronto, you're basically like, all right, who gives us the best chance going forward as a prospect to be a part of our next core? And that's what you're really looking at. Like, just specific players aside, like you want a player that you can rely upon for leadership, production, and overall effectiveness. And that's really where you kind of stick with 8. Like, you get a high value player there, and potentially, like, if you're really, really all in, and I would highly, highly be against this, but if there's a player like Alex DeBrincat from the Ottawa Senators that's on the block and it takes the 8th pick to get him, is that something you do?
That's an interesting point. That would definitely be an upgrade, and you would have an NHL ready player. So, I mean, that is an interesting thought there. The one thing I'm confident in is that Ross Mahoney and his guys always, I think, do a good job there. If you want to take a look at Miroshnichenko, he could have gone much higher in the draft, but he had that Hodgkin's lymphoma, and the Capitals got a steal there. I think that, he will end up being a really great addition to this Capitals team at some point. But when we talk draft capital, it doesn't have to be used exclusively on this year's draft, and they do have quite a bit of draft capital. The Caps now have 6 picks in the 2023 NHL draft, including 2 first-round picks and 3 total picks in the first 2 rounds. Washington owns the 1st, 2nd, 4th, 5th, and 7th round picks, as well as Boston's 1st round pick in 2023. The Caps have acquired a 2023 1st round pick, a 2025 2nd round pick, a 2024 3rd round pick, and forward Craig Smith when they were in the trade with Dmitry Orlov and Garnet Hathaway. So at the moment, that was a tough thing for me, peeling that Band-Aid off. You see how Orlov has been killing it out in Boston, but I think that it was for the better good, because this is going to help the Capitals team in the future. As we know, it's been said that Orlov wanted a 6-year deal and Mac was in more like a 3-year deal. So it just wasn't going to happen. So it's best that the Caps just moved on. All right. So after the break here, we're going to talk about what UFAs on this team should the Capitals try to get to come back to this team. Is there anyone in free agency this offseason that they should try to target? We'll talk about that straight ahead. So one of the things that I don't like is trying to find tickets last minute. That is why you need GameTime. Buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful. GameTime is the fast and easy way to buy your tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you with killer deals on last minute tickets and their best price guarantee. You can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped over the fun you'll have. This includes flash deals and last-minute tickets, easy to find, buy tickets for every kind of event in your area, images of the seat view so you can actually see what you'll be seeing when you're in your seat, and the lowest price guarantee, event cancellation protection, and job loss protection. So snag the tickets without the stress at GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download GameTime today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make sure and subscribe to Locked On Capitals, as I have some big guests this summer. I have Mike Vogel and John Walton on the show. And in this episode, Justin Trudel, a big guest here from Nova Caps. So an interesting thing that I've been talking about on this show for a while is that Tom Wilson is going to be a UFA after next season. And I was reading some different things in the Bleacher Report, and they could see Tom Wilson on the Dallas Stars. And then I read in the very Nova Caps that they talked about the untouchables. And one of the things that they had said was that Tom Wilson should be an untouchable unless they get offered a crazy deal. I'm curious, what kind of crazy deal would that be? I understand you didn't write that piece, but it seems a bit out there that the Caps would entertain any idea of moving Wilson on for whatever that potential player could be.
To me, there's probably that like 100th of a percent likelihood of a deal that would cross McClellan's desk that would make him decide to trade Wilson. There's one that could be really interesting from just like the point production standpoint and adding like a mutual beneficial kind of deal there, which would be a package with Toronto centered around William Nylander and Tom Wilson.
Mm.
Obviously, 1-for-1 will work for the Caps. Like,
Yeah.
it's just, like you lose too much by losing Wilson to really just take on a player that's purely offensively capable. But from the standpoint of like, Nylander signed for a decent contract. He's been very productive up and down the lineup in Toronto, but that trade would have to include picks back to Washington, just because like there's value that Tom Wilson adds that isn't on the score sheet. We know that. We've watched him for years now. He has a physical presence. He's gotten smarter about using his physical presence in the past couple of years, especially after the kind of 20 game suspension back in 2018-19. He's learned from that. He's gotten better, more effective. He's picking his spots, and once he came back, once he got up to speed, obviously he had that fracture in his ankle or lower leg after blocking a shot. But when he got back to it, like he started scoring goals again. He looked more like himself. So I think for the most part, like that value add there is really hard to let go of. And I think you see that in McClellan's comments during the breakdown day press conferences, which is like, we want to keep Wilson. We want him to finish up as a Capital, is the wording he used there. And Wilson said, like, I'm not playing hardball. I love it here. I want to stay here. So the big question to me is, like, one, is Wilson your future captain after Ovechkin retires? And I think that's probably a yes if you do extend him this offseason, which I would expect. I would expect an 8-year deal this offseason. The question for me is, what does that price point look like? Because we've seen other core members of the team currently like want to stay in DC. The team wants to keep him there. Like they're looking at Ovechkin and Backstrom, and even Carlson going back to 27-18. Is they didn't take discounts, right? Like you look at Backstrom, he's getting $9.2 million a year. Ovechkin's getting around 9.5. So it's like these are kind of like conflicting issues where you have like an aging core that's on very expensive contracts that want to continue competing for the playoffs, where you can't really supplement the supporting cast around them. So it's like, to me, like, what is Wilson worth on the open market? And
Crazy.
I think if he hit unrestricted free agency next July, there would be 31 teams in the NHL lining up to sign him. And even the Capitals could potentially be in the mix of all 32. And there would be 7-year deals thrown out there for him, just because like that's what it takes to get elite players in the NHL today. Obviously, he's not elite point getter. He's not going to score 40 goals and put up 82 plus points a season. But for the most part, like he can play in all situations. He's a physical force. He can pitch in offensively. He still has great skating speed. To me, it's like, if it's a $6 million cap hit for 8 years, is that something that's easy to swallow or hard to swallow? And I think that's the biggest question for me.
All right, Justin, I have appointed you to be the GM of the team. Are you going to make that deal, or are you going to move on from Tom Wilson?
I'm not moving on from Tom Wilson unless I get 5 first-round picks in a trade, right? Like at that point, like, are they late firsts, or is the team like Anaheim coming to me because they want more winger depth and some physical upside, right? Like there's a big question there from the asset management side. Is like, he's been a stalwart for you for years now, especially the top 6. The Capitals right now are severely lacking in the top 6 category. Like if you look across the league among competitive teams, the top 6, like outside of Ovechkin and Strome this season, weren't really that great, right? Like we had some hits and misses. Sherry looked good for a stretch there, but for the most part, like probably have 2, maybe 3 top 6 capable forwards on the team now. Obviously, Oshie is aging. He's probably best suited for a third line role. Backstrom's aging, third line role if he kind of sticks with playing in the NHL, and the Caps don't have to make a tough decision there. But I think for the most part, it's like, yes, I think you do extend Wilson, and you kind of deal with the cap ramifications next summer.
All right, so after the break here, we will talk about what is Nick Backstrom's future in DC. We'll talk about that straight ahead. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Next, we will talk about Nick Backstrom's future in DC. Yeah, so one of the things that I had done is I listed my three untouchables. It was Ovechkin, Wilson, and Carlson. And people are like, "Well, did you forget about Backstrom and Oshie?" And no, I didn't. And I don't think we should give those players away. But it is my belief that Nick Backstrom is on the back nine of his NHL career. We've seen dips in production, and McClellan sounded non-committal about his future. He said that Backstrom is going to have to make decisions on his future. So it is interesting that McClellan has taken that posture, given the fact of who that Backstrom is. And it's going to be a difficult guy if they do decide to move on from him, because Max said that they bounce a lot of ideas off Ovi. And you got to think that, if Ovi has any say about it, he might hit the veto button on that. What are your thoughts on Backstrom? Is he a viable option still for Washington?
So it's a very good question, because, Backstrom's historically been one of my favorite players, so this is a tough pill to swallow for sure. When I was listening to McClellan's press conference, and the question asked wasn't like, "Are you concerned with Backstrom's performance?" It was, "How do you feel about Backstrom's comments about being optimistic about next season with having a full season to train, or full off season to train?" And him being very candid about being like, "I don't know how much he's going to improve. Like, there's no path forward. Like, there's no clear path forward there. We're gonna have to make decisions, here, probably by training camp with Backstrom." To me, the hip resurfacing surgery was a really risky play from Backstrom, and I get it. I completely get it. From like, I want to go out on my own terms. I want to play until I'm done and make that decision myself, rather than an injury ending my career for me. And obviously, the day-to-day pains of just like not being able to tie your shoe is a huge impact. And obviously, he's more pain-free now. But when you look back at the history of hip resurfacing procedures done on NHL players, there's two that stick out. One is Ryan Kessler. He had hip resurfacing done on both hips and never played an NHL game after the first procedure. And then you had Ed Jovanovski of the Panthers, who got it. He played 37 games after getting the hip resurfacing procedure done, was bought out by the Panthers that offseason, and then retired. So with 39 games played this season from Backstrom, that he's already played the most games in the NHL for a player that's gotten hip resurfacing surgery. So obviously, you're coming in mid-season, you haven't really had a ton of time to train, get up to speed, get the feel of the game back. Could Backstrom improve? Yes. I don't know if he gets anywhere near his market value in terms of what he signed to a contract of like $9-ish million. And that's a contract that really hampers you from competing, because one, what do you do with a franchise hallmark that's
right?
Clearly, like you said, back nine, I think he's probably 17th hole. It's tough to say, because like obviously he's a great player. He's been a real cornerstone for this franchise throughout the Ovechkin era. We don't win a Stanley Cup without him. We wouldn't be a competitive team without him. It's getting to the point where if Backstrom goes through the summer and doesn't feel like he's gained enough in his like conditioning or his performance in training, does he make the decision to either retire and the Caps take care of him and say like, okay, yeah, if you retire, like you don't have to worry about the money, we'll take care of you and you'll have a spot here in the organization doing something. That's the big question to me. But the harder move is you go through training camp, he doesn't look good. He looks, the same or even worse than he did last season. What do you do as McClellan in that scenario? Because you're pretty much past the buyout window. And at the end of this past season, his no movement clause moved to a no trade clause with a 10-team no trade list or 15-team no trade list.
Yeah.
Does that list include Arizona?
Right.
I mean, like that's the biggest question to me is like, I don't envy McClellan's position right now, just because like one, there's definitely a certain subset of fans, and we see it in comments on the Nova Caps site a lot, is like Backstrom's cap hit needs to disappear. If you get Backstrom at 75% effectiveness from what he usually was. Okay, I think we can make that work. But if he's like kind of near where he is or was this season, it's probably not great. He was, when we look at his goals above replacement value, which kind of helps us. It's basically similar to how baseball uses wins above replacement, right? We gauge player value based off of that compared to a replacement level player, which is pretty much like, for baseball, it's like a AAA plus player, right? Someone that you just get anywhere for free. Backstrom was sub replacement level this past season for the first time in his career. That's typically not a trend you see for a player in his mid 30s to reverse substantially. So you're looking at a player like best case scenario, maybe back to replacement level, and you're paying him $9+ million a year, and you're trying to compete for the playoffs. Like if we were in a complete rebuilding scenario, like okay, let him ride it out, he'll make a decision. But where we're standing today, if we're trying to make the playoffs next year, does Backstrom help or hurt our chances?
So, Justin, I want to thank you once again for joining us on this edition of Locked On Capitals. Why don't you tell everyone where we can find your work?
Yeah, so I write for Nova Caps, so you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. You can go directly to our site, novacapsfans.com. You can find me on Twitter at StayTrue20.
All right, Justin, once again, thank you for joining us on this edition of Locked On Capitals, where it's your team every day. My name is Dan Holme, and I'll talk to you again next time.